Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. On this week's podcast, Jessica Pack, Assistant Professor at the University of Wisconsin Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, and Sophie Collyer, Research Director for the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University, join us to talk about an interesting simulation study they were both part of that tries to get at gauging the impact of various packages of anti-poverty measures on child protection cases. Before we get to that conversation, let's hit a few headlines of late, and we can start in Washington, D.C., where the federal clearinghouse that approves foster care prevention services under the Family First Act has okayed 5 new programs while rejecting 7 different models that had an evidence base that it assessed as not meeting criteria for inclusion on the clearinghouse. People that aren't familiar with this terminology, the Title 4E Prevention Services Clearinghouse was established in relation to the Family First Act, which passed in February of 2018. And the law enables states to use the Title 4E entitlement now, which used to be just for foster care and adoption, to fund services that are aimed at working with parents without the need for family separation into foster care. So each approved model of services by the clearinghouse is given one of these 3 ratings: well supported is the best, supported, or promising. The approvals from this kind of round right now bring the total number of approved services for preventing foster care to 65. My count is 65. I guess it depends whether you're counting, different versions of the same model as different or not. But I have 65 with 15 of them with that top rating of well supported, 16 as supported, and then 34 as promising practices. By my count, they have rejected now 61 programs as not meeting the criteria. So just some of the services that were approved this time that kind of jumped out to me. The biggest one that jumped out to me is the Foster Kinship Navigator program. That is a version of the Kinship Navigator, which is sort of a one-stop shop concept for helping relatives and fictive kin who are taking kids in. So they range in the services they offer, across the country. Kinship Navigators can actually supply financial assistance to kinship caregivers, respite care, counseling sessions, more kind of material resources, right? Like just clothing or help pointing people in the direction of benefits, all that kind of stuff. So the one that was approved as a promising practice in this last round is Foster Kinship Navigator program. And that was born out of Nevada. It's an operation there. That is now the 3rd Kinship Navigator model that's been approved by the clearinghouse, which I'm sure is starting to come as a relief for the many people that are interested in ramping up the percentage of youth who are in foster care that are living with relatives and fictive kin. We went a long time after the Family First Act was passed where no kinship navigators had really met the threshold that the clearinghouse had. So a few were up for consideration and were rejected as not meeting criteria. There was a breakthrough about 2 years ago, an Ohio model that actually kind of isn't really in use anywhere, got approved, and it was a pretty limited model. It only worked with kids who were kind of officially part of the child welfare system, where a lot of kinship navigators kind of take a broader view. And then I think it was only like 4 months ago that the second model out of Colorado got approved. And now we have a third one coming out of Nevada that got very good results as they, did the work of evaluating their effectiveness in hopes of getting into this clearinghouse. So Great day for those folks in Nevada, in particular, Ali Caliendo, who is really one of the more knowledgeable people about child welfare that I know. So in addition to that kinship navigator model, I would say the other ones that kind of jumped out to me are the multi-systemic therapy version that was approved. MST has been approved for a while. Building Stronger Families is the sort of sub-brand of it that got approved in this round. And that is a version of multi-systemic therapy that really focuses on parents who are struggling with substance abuse issues, as well as another one that was approved, screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment, which everybody just refers to as SBIRT by its kind of acronym, which again, this one is used with youth and adults who are struggling with moderate to severe substance use disorders. That got a promising rating. So it is good to, you're seeing more models of service enter the clearinghouse that are actually about the issue that really was kind of the wind behind the sails of getting Family First passed, which is helping parents who are struggling with substance abuse. And in particular, I would say that the opioid crisis was the thing that really kind of got the momentum going for Family First, helping them to work through and get help and get support without resorting to a removal into foster care. Okay, next up is a federal lawsuit that I'll be very interested to see how much traction this gets and where this goes in the courts. So Jessica Bates, an Oregon mother of 5, she was relatively recently widowed in a tragic car accident that took the life of her husband. She is interested in adopting a sibling pair out of foster care. She is suing the state of Oregon and the county that she lives in because she is arguing that the sort of attestations that she needs to make to become certified as an adoptive parent who would first foster children violate her religious beliefs. And this is just language from her lawsuit that she's refusing to agree to, quote, respect, accept, and support the sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression of any child that the department could place in an applicant's home because of their faith. Bates is basically asking for relief from the federal courts, presumably in the form of a ruling saying that the state of Oregon, the county that she is trying to adopt in, can't infringe upon her religious beliefs by forcing her to say, essentially, I will support the sexual identity, the gender identity of a child that comes into my house through this process. And this is not anything new necessarily in the national landscape when it comes to child welfare. It's just sort of like a rung below or like a level down. And I guess it was kind of, now that I think about it, really always bound to happen because we've had now, I think, a dozen states, maybe even more, where legislation has been passed to basically guarantee that faith-based providers in those states are shielded from any sort of adverse actions by the state for following their religious beliefs. So in other words, a nonprofit organization that has a religious bent, whether it's Christian or something else, and doesn't wish to license or work with foster parents who are a same-sex couple or even just a single parent or somebody of a different religion, there are several states that have passed those pieces of legislation. And again, I think we're at like 12 or 13 now. I haven't seen anybody successfully challenge, really almost haven't seen anybody challenge them in court yet. Keep waiting around for that. I guess there are a few. I think maybe somebody came at Tennessee's version of that law, if I'm remembering this correctly. So anyway, what Ms. Bates is doing is sort of just taking that on a more granular level and saying that I as a foster to adopt parent, should also be shielded from adverse actions. And I think one thing that's going to be interesting in parsing her seeking relief there is that I think there would be a significant difference between having that right as a foster parent and having that right as an adoptive parent. Give me a little wiggle room to kind of explore this rhetorically, because this is not necessarily what I feel or I believe, but when you are fostering a child, you are working on behalf of the state to support that child, presumably in most cases until they go home, or they very likely will end up in another place, not live with you. And so the idea that you would not have to sign whatever requirements that a state or a county put on you in terms of supporting those children, those children are in the custody of the state. The state is completely in the right to force you to fulfill, a particular expectation in terms of how those youth will be treated and viewed and accepted. The circumstance of adoption seems to be very, very different from that, in that while the state may be engaged with an adoptive parent for a small period of time as there's a transition being made from foster care to a full permanent adoption that's been finalized and signed off on, and the state may also be involved in paying for adoption subsidies for quite a long time, really until kids are 18. There is an adoption finalization, and that is really the end of the state's custody of a child and the beginning of, full-time unfettered custody is kind of the expectation that we have for adoptive parents. So adoptive parents really aren't different than biological parents or any other parents as far as the law is concerned with their ability to run their household. So it is interesting to expect somebody to sign something that says essentially like, I promise as a parent, I will fulfill this, set of expectations that no other parent who happens to be the biological parents of a child would have to agree to. We have many, many parents around this country who do not condone different aspects of children's lifestyles and gender identities. I mean, that is obviously something that transcends, this phenomenon or this case that Miss Bates has brought up. I think just the last piece of context that's kind of important for this. I'll drop a very good story from the Oregonian about this case in the show notes here. But I think the one other piece of context here is we're not talking about actual specific children. There are not children who identify in a different way as far as gender or sexual orientation that might be coming to Jessica Bates's house, and that's what we're talking about. These are theoretical children. We're talking about her views as a parent for children that she has not met yet, have not been identified as, candidates to be foster or adoptive children for her. Anyway, this is definitely, I think, going to get some traction in the courts. So it'll be interesting to see whether this gets up to the appellate court or not. So I guess we'll continue to stay on it. All right, two great pieces from the imprint that I would like to recommend to everybody. And again, as always, we'll drop the links in the show notes. The first one is the piece by Nell Bernstein and Lila Burke about a fairly unprecedented effort to connect California youth who are detained or incarcerated with college coursework. This is something that the state of California has invested millions of dollars into recently to expand this effort. Our story is really rooted in Project Change, comes out of San Mateo County, which is really the one that got the ball rolling. So check the story out. It's a compelling strategy in that there are well-known problems with delivering basic high school education in juvenile facilities. The quality of the coursework, the jumble of different age groups in some of these places, the issues with transferring credits and moving youth back into their schools of origins. And that's all to the side of the fact that it will be hard to draw up an environment more conducive to learning and thinking than, a very ugly juvenile facility. So it'll be really fascinating as the state expands this work and presumably, hopefully, tracks and evaluates its participants and where they go afterwards, and see whether this is, this more aspirational approach of kind of leading with college, particularly for older youth who are incarcerated, leads to, high rates of reconnection education or really any pursuit of, careers and vocation after they come home. Second piece I wanted to recommend is from Jeremy Loudenbeck. It is about a benefits eligibility finder that was developed by the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services for youth and young adults who are exiting foster care. Now, that does not sound like the sexiest topic, right? They built a website kind of portal for benefits. I think it's a step in the right direction as far as this goes, though, because we have seen in sort of surveys with foster youth and caseworkers, and just anecdotally, I have talked to many current and former foster youth who have experienced the fact that, we sort of operate under the assumption that there's always going to be a caseworker who is on it, or somebody within the system who is really making sure that young people that are transitioning out from their teens or their early 20s into adulthood are prepared with, information about all the different things that we owe youth who end up in that situation, for whom the system has really not achieved permanency at any point in their teen years. And the reality is just that that's not the case. There are certainly great caseworkers and great workers all over the place who do that work and make sure that kids know, hey, you are eligible for, Chafee ETV money to help pay for college or this or that. But the reality is there's just too many young people who don't know in time or are not helped to prepare for all the different things that they should be able to take advantage of. And so Los Angeles County here is trying to kind of provide a technological solution to this in the form of just a kind of simple if-then approach on this system, right? You go in, you kind of just plug in some very basic information about yourself, your age, your experience in the system, and it kind of just spits out what types of things, as far as college tuition support or food stamps or, housing vouchers that you might be eligible for. So still have to get the name out there and make sure that all youth will know about this in Los Angeles, because the ultimate irony would be a technological fix to the fact that kids don't know about the benefits that they have coming to them, and the irony being that they didn't know about the thing that helps them know. So there's definitely going to be some brand recognition work that has to happen with that portal. It might have been easier if it was a phone app or something, because I think young people are much more mobile, but still a very worthwhile concept. So again, take a look at that story. Last thing for this week, we have discussed on the podcast before the tragic death of Cornelius Fredericks, a teenager in Michigan who was killed in a residential placement after he was, caught throwing a sandwich in a cafeteria and then was restrained by several employees of the Lakeside Academy and died during that restraint. So the family has already settled on that matter in terms of a civil suit with Lakeside Academy in the state. And last month, the two former youth counselors who were involved in Cornelius' death, Zachary Solis and Michael Mosley, both entered pleas of no contest for involuntary manslaughter in his death. So those pleas were entered. Both of those men had been charged with second-degree child abuse and second-degree child abuse causing death. And so hopefully will bring just an added kind of layer, to the extent it's possible, of closure to the family and friends of Cornelius Fredericks. Okay, when we come back, our interview with Jessica Pack and Sophie Collyer.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
We are joined today by Jessica Pack, assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin's Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, and Sophie Collyer, research director for the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University, two authors of a new attempt to estimate the impact of child poverty reduction on child welfare involvement. So Jessica and Sophie, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast, guys.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much for having us.
So let's get these guys to know you a little bit before we get into the weeds. I'm going to need both of you to give me one of your favorites. The categories are TV show, movie, book, musical group, or sports team. Jessica, I'm going to you first. What do you got?
I would have to say Thinking Fast and So Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Number one.
Good choice. Good choice. Work relevant, but still fun. Good deal.
It's fascinating. You can read it over and over and over again and learn something new every single time.
There was this run where I had like 3 op-eds in a span of like 2 months submitted to us that were like built on the backbone of the book. And you're just like, whoa,
it's
this guy's really had an impact on people. All right, Sophie, TV, movie, book, musical group, sports team. What do you got?
Well, my favorite musical group is The Cure. And I'm very excited because they're coming to New York soon, but also very sad because the tickets are just
so
out of this
expensive.
world expensive.
Yeah.
So
I'm really
I
on
don't
the
think
fence.
that'll happen.
Yeah.
But it's fun that they're still touring so many years
I
post
know.
peak.
The Michigan lawn tickets aren't too bad.
Oh,
If
really?
you
So maybe I can
look.
fly there. It'll
You
be
might for more
less than the
for New York.
garden.
Yeah. Well, I hope you do get it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think to understand what you guys did and the estimates you arrived at, we kind of have to understand the work that it jumps off. I'll set it up a little, and maybe you guys can fill in because you know it a lot better than I will. So right before the pandemic, 2019, the National Academies of Sciences put forth this roadmap for reducing child poverty in America, which recent research and data has suggested if you go by, the supplemental poverty measure, we're doing okay at. But this was work that was done to provide a look at these like 4 different packages of anti-poverty supports of varying degrees of generousness and what impact they'd have on child poverty. And I guess their outcomes were that these different packages would reduce child poverty by, I think, between 19% and 52%. So maybe you guys could talk a little bit, tell the listeners a little bit about like what types of things were in these packages in terms of like anti-poverty supports. What did the NAS kind of focus on here?
There were several policy packages put forward by the NAS with committee that had this charge of like, can you design some policies that would reduce child poverty in the United States by half? Knowing that child poverty has been a persistent issue in the country and is well above rates in other high income countries as well. And so they pulled together a combination of policy packages that included reforms across several existing anti-poverty policies, some of which substantially changed them and some of which were kind of more modifications or tweaks. So this included expansions across all packages. They included an expansion to the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. So the EITC supplements wages, while this Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit helps families with childcare costs, but it's not fully refundable. And many low-income families are basically completely ineligible for this credit. And as we know, childcare costs are extremely high. And so part of their reforms was expanding the CDCTC. And that was across all of the packages. But they also included reforms to SNAP and the child tax credit and Section 8 and the minimum wage. And these kind of were dispersed throughout these different packages. And I can speak specifically about one we saw in action in 2021, which was they had a proposal to make the child tax credit fully refundable. That was single policy across the packages that had the most direct effect on the child poverty rate. And that was outlined in this report and was in part of package 2 and 4.
Yeah, so they kind of called a little bit, right, to some extent, like what happened. I think they refer to it as a child allowance in their model, but that essentially was what the child tax credit advanced version became.
Exactly. So what they did was, part of their proposal was, first step was to make the child tax credit fully refundable. So under current law, the CTC that's in effect today and was in effect before the 2021 expansion is tied to earnings. So you need to earn a certain amount in order to qualify for the full credit. And this is well above like $30,000 for most family sizes in order to receive the full credit. And because of that refundability structure, 1 in 3 children do not receive the full credit. So it's $2,000 per child in their current law, but it's not fully refundable. So you have this big gap in coverage. And so the NAS, the first package discussed expanding and making the credit fully refundable to fill that gap. And then also later packages discussed increasing the credit value.
So I'd almost say like for like the average listener at home, like almost picture it like a streaming service where you're like definitely going to get a few things like in any package, but then you could add stuff to make it way better, or more likely in this case to reduce poverty, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
maybe more comprehensive, right?
More comprehensive is a good way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get to kind of like what you guys did off of this, there was one line that I wanted to ask you about kind of as you set up your findings and your methodology. You mentioned in the sort of preamble of the study that despite decades of progress, child poverty in the United States remains alarmingly high. When I was introducing you guys, I kind of flippantly mentioned that there's this kind of recent, research that Child Trends has done to show really just how much by the supplemental measure, child poverty has declined from the mid-90s. So I guess I was curious, like what you meant by that. I don't know as much about the more traditional standard have we really not moved? I thought the word remains was the thing I was going to ask you about is, has that remained intransigent when you take out the supplemental stuff?
It's a great question. So there are kind of two different poverty measures before thinking about the supplemental poverty measures. So in the United States, we've consistently had a measure of poverty using the official measures called the OPM. And that does not account for the many anti-poverty policies in its accounting of household resources. And it also uses a poverty that is the same across the country and doesn't vary by cost of living. So there are other kind of issues with it that the supplemental poverty measure improves upon, but those are the two big ones. And when you're thinking about the SPM, you can think about the poverty rate before accounting for all income from transfers and things like tax credits, and then afterwards. And so when you look at the child poverty rates under the SPM from the late 60s to today, you do see this significant decline in child poverty rate over that period. And work by our director and colleagues, Chris Weimer and Liana Fox, and many colleagues at CPSP, built the data set that allowed to assess those trends over time. And so there were kind of coming out of about 10 years, or I can't remember exactly the year right now, but they've documented this significant decline in child poverty over that period when you account for the role of government policy. But when you look at the pre-tax transfer poverty rates, you don't see as significant a decline. So a lot of the declines in child poverty, or majority of the decline in child poverty over this period, is the result of government intervention.
Right. So it's basically like we have not really moved the needle much on actually increasing the number of people who've been able to earn their way income-wise out of poverty, but we've done a much better job of mollifying that problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like the labor market is.
Can you guys attempt in layman's terms? I know research is complicated, especially when you're, simulating a simulation almost a little bit, right, in this one. But can you guys kind of attempt in layman's terms to sort of explain how you guys took what the national academies did and used it then to simulate or try to figure out, okay, what would all of this do to the world of child welfare and child protection?
Sure. So maybe I'll give a little background. So the reason that we had to do a simulation is because there actually doesn't exist national data that captures both parental family income and involvement with child protective services, which is what we think is the best, maybe least biased measure of child abuse and neglect. So because of that, we had to find a way to connect these two data points in a way that's meaningful, right? So what we were interested in doing was estimating the causal effect of all these reductions in child poverty and child abuse and neglect. But we can't do that because these data don't exist. So what we did instead is simulate if all of these policies were put into place for families for whom we do observe detailed income and work measures, what would be the effect? And of course, because we can't model the causal effect, we used the causal effect of income that we drew from other studies. So I'll let Sophie describe how she implemented the simulation of the packages of policies, and then I can explain how we linked that to child abuse and neglect.
The NAS report, as we said, has this robust series of these 4 packages. And a great thing is that there's also an appendix that details all of the ways in which they estimated the effects of those policy packages on the poverty rate. And so our first step was to see, okay, can we kind of learn from what they did and apply a similar methodology in the current population survey, which is the standard survey used to measure poverty under the SPM, and apply that methodology in there to resimulate the policy packages in the NAS report. And that was step 1. And we did a good job kind of matching their outcomes. There were some slight differences between the data sets that we used. They used data set that called the TRIM data set that adjusts for some levels of underreporting, and we used the standard CPS without those adjustments. But otherwise, we kind of took their approach and remodeled all of the packages in the CPS. And then I sent the data over to Jessica.
And then what did you do, Jessica?
So basically, what that means though is, in the NAS report, there's basically these, estimated, suggested policy packages that would give so much money to a person or a family that has this much in income, or who has, this marital status and this much in income, right? So they're very specific. And because the CPS data has very specific data on income, it allows us to say specifically, this family would receive this much from this package, this much from this package, and this much from this package.
Right.
And that's important because we then basically had to figure out for each additional dollar that a family receives, how would that affect their risk of becoming involved with CPS? So to do that, what we basically did was we used this national data that captures administrative CPS records or CPS encounters where a family is alleged to be a perpetrator of abuse and neglect, or a child is alleged to be a victim of abuse and neglect. And then that allegation is screened in for investigation. So that's what a CPS report is.
Right.
So we basically use these data at the national level, and we collapse them to meaningful cells. So in our case, we looked at children's rates of involvement with Child Protective Services at the level of their race, ethnicity, age, county, year, and I think there was one other factor. But basically, we wanted to see as fine, as granular as we could get, what are the odds of being involved with CPS?
Sorry to interrupt, but there's obviously lots of ways to define being involved with CPS.
Mm-hmm.
You guys chose that investigation level, right? As sort of your
right.
North Star metric.
Yeah, the reason being that we know that there's agencies that have higher levels of resources, for example, to screen in more reports or fewer reports.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's obviously bias in involvement with CPS, like in mandated reporting, for example. So this measure seems to be the measure that most policy researchers use because it captures the more concerning reports without capturing the things that are screened out. So things that are maybe less concerning or there's less information on them. But it also is less likely to capture agency resources. So this is the measure that we use. But we also adjust it based on, well, let me take a step back. So we have this granular estimate. So for a child with this race, ethnicity in this county, so on and so forth, what are their risks of involvement with CPS? And then with the current population survey, we observe individual children living in families. So we basically link to that child this estimate of CPS involvement based on that national administrative data. And then we adjust the estimate based on the risk factors that we're able to observe. So for example, if there's, more children in the family, or if the child's living with their grandparents, so on and so forth, then we adjust that estimate so that it matches national estimates. Make sense?
It does. And it's just pretty cool. I mean, I don't want to reduce everything you guys have said to a soundbite, but really the NAS was tasked with imagining what baskets of things would yield a macro population change in child poverty. And you guys were able to kind of basically use that to run another simulation that imagines what that change would have on the child protection system in America.
Right.
It's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
Well, there's one piece that I left out, that we know that there's, poverty and CPS involvement are highly correlated, but we were really interested in the causal effect of each dollar. And so this was kind of the point of being able to see for each additional dollar, or in our case, we scaled it to $1,000 that a family receives, how does that impact their risk of involvement in CPS? So,
gotcha.
Yeah, because it's interesting. There's the outcome, right, in the NAS report is you're looking at poverty. But the reason there's this reduction in poverty is because there's an increase in income. And we know the association between those the income dollars and CPS involvement. So we're able to get the change in income as a result of these packages and then run it through the model that Jessica was talking about.
So you guys run this all, do the simulation, and big reveal is what? What do you guys find would be the impact of this on child protection investigations on that level?
So we find, depending on which policy package is being observed, like which one we're simulating, we find that the reduction of poverty leads to a reduction in CPS investigations by 11.3 to 19.7%, which is equivalent to 386,000 to 669,000 children annually. We also find that there's larger reductions in CPS involvement for non-white children. So for Black, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic children, we find substantially larger. So for example, for Black children, we find an 18.7 to 28.5% reduction. And for Hispanic, we find 13.3 to 24.4% reduction relative to white children, for whom we find 6 to 13% reduction.
Wow. So we're talking like 3 to 4 times more of an outsized effect for Black children. And then what, 2 times more? I'm bad at math.
Yep.
2 times more for Hispanic kids. Right.
Yep.
So that is obviously quite significant. And I mean, I guess I don't know how to phrase this question because I'm not a research mind, but is your assumption that that would be an outcome that would sort of replicate at a fairly stable rate year to year, or would there be a compounding effect as society changed? You know what I mean? Like, is that the first year and then it would be even better, or would it start to tail off? Like, am I asking that right?
Yeah. I mean, so there's this like growing body of evidence that investments in children and in families early on in children's life leads to much larger returns later on in their life. And we know that with child maltreatment prevention, early intervention is optimal, right? Removal, if a child is actually being abused or neglected, removal early is generally positive, as these new causal studies have been demonstrating, especially because we think that this would affect not just current children, but then also future children. The expectation would be that the effect of the policies would grow over time, but not just in terms of immediate interactions between children and families and CPS, but those long-term benefits as well, right? Through reducing stress for families, increasing means, making sure that families, can invest in their children the way that they want to.
I like that you added here, even though the focal point was the investigations, this sort of, I think you called it a back of the envelope calculation on sort of more downstream stuff. So if I have this right, you guys would project just sort of if everything was proportional, that this decline in investigations would yield up to 106,000 less substantiated cases of maltreatment and up to 23,000 less children being placed in foster care every year, which is about a 10% decline in entries, right? If that was to happen.
Yeah, exactly. So what we did was, like you said, we just used the back of the envelope calculation. So we will say that this estimation was done with data from before COVID. So obviously things have changed, and the strength of those estimates might have changed as well, but the same story is basically there.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
I think the one mark that would be a real tell here would be, if these things were happening, like the simulation would suggest, would be that percent of cases substantiated. If that went way up, it would almost tell you that it was working. Because I feel like foster care entries, I don't know if the data suggests that they're as responsive solely to anti-poverty measures as that would be, that substantiation rate.
I agree. I think that's a good measure, especially the substantiation rate among children who have their first encounter with CPS would be especially salient of a measure. I agree, because foster care depends on so many other things, right? Like a lack of 4E funding or, budget cycles, right? It depends on a lot of other things. So I would definitely say substantiation rate is a better measure.
Yeah. I'm curious what kind of feedback and response you've gotten that you've heard, because I would imagine this will excite some folks in that there have been, things that have been viewed to be positive changes in child welfare, but very little that seems to have moved the needle in actually reducing the racial disparities in child welfare. And this is a pretty definitive statement that these packages would do that.
Mm-hmm. I'd say so. Sophie and I have been presenting this project. So this is part of a bigger collaboration with a large group of wonderful, collaborators. And we've been presenting this for a while, and we generally receive like very positive feedback, and folks just thinking about, right, so how do we do this where we live? Sometimes we'll present with smaller groups of people, and people get really excited Or other times we've presented with people who it just hadn't occurred to them, right, that there was this connection between family stress and financial well-being and involvement with CPS, right? So I think it presents maybe I wouldn't say a new way of thinking about maltreatment prevention, because there's certainly a large foundational, research that establishes that this relationship exists and is very meaningful. But it does kind of show by how much in a way that's meaningful to folks. It enables us, right, to think, if I were to invest $1 today, what would I get, tomorrow? So I think it is meaningful, right, for policymakers and practitioners.
And also lots of the policies that are introduced in the report, aren't outside the realm of, it's not, these are things that are definitely within the realm of the possible. And so I think that also reinforces the importance of the findings, where these are reforms that we saw kind of quickly enacted during the pandemic. And that just suggests that they could also some of them could quickly be reinstated to achieve like certain goals and reductions.
Yeah, I like that you guys threw that into the language in the study, just sort of noting that, even at the time when this was put together by NAS, it was kind of like inconceivable that there'd be some of these things in play, and that it just happened right afterwards, So I guess in a way, would you say that, to the extent that we have data about the pandemic era, or the opening stanzas of the pandemic era, that stuff is confirmatory of your simulation? I mean, would you go that far to say that to some extent?
So there's only been a handful of studies that I've seen, and like there's one that hasn't been published, but I saw at a conference recently. It was looking at the Alaska Permanence Fund. It was Lindsay Bullinger and Elisa Peckham, and there was one other co-author. But basically, they found estimates that were really similar in magnitude to ours. And there's another more recent study, also with Lindsay Bullinger, who also finds an effect of the expanded child tax credit on ER visits among kids.
Right. Yep.
Maltreatment, right? So this, they're starting to head in this direction. They all kind of look at a little bit of a different thing and ask a little bit of a different question. But basically, they agree, right, that this is really beneficial for families in the short run and the long run.
Yeah. So I'll throw this out there, and this kind of gets the politics of like the findings here. And if you two want to just say we're researchers, this isn't our lane, it's okay. I've obviously consumed your study. I've read a lot of the stuff that Lindsay's put out, and some of the other things that she and others have done on minimum wage and their correlation reports, right? And I just wonder if this is all research that is kind of confirming something that ultimately nobody's going to be comfortable putting forth as like a policy argument, which is that a really good primary reason for a more generous anti-poverty attack in this country would be because less kids will be maltreated, or more families will not be involved with the system, at least, as opposed to that just being kind of a nice side benefit of it. You know what I mean? Like, I think that at some point, somebody is going to have to stick their toe out and make that case or not. And I don't know that I've seen that yet, as like, we need to do all these things because it means children will be more safe. Really has just been the purview of research and kind of the policy wonky child welfare circles for now.
I mean, I think putting children at the front and center of policies and decision-making around policies is, I think, something that we should always be doing, but we don't. So it does feel like a reach to say, well, not only should we think about children and their well-being, but also about, their safety and their involvement with CPS and all these other ancillary things that we should be concerned about with child well-being, like their health, right? But given this evidence on the importance of early childhood and childhood in general to their long-term economic well-being and the health and human capital, it's not just the short-run benefits, but it's also the long-run benefits. So that argument makes sense to me, and I know it makes sense to Sophie, right? As folks who do really broadly cover these the benefits of health and human capital in the long term. I think part of the problem is that we just don't tend to center children when we think of policy and, financial well-being and economic well-being. And there's, of course, naysayers who are concerned, well, we could put these policies in place and families might, misuse the money or won't actually go to the children, won't actually benefit their health. But that's not what the really robust research is showing. It's showing that children do benefit in multiple ways. So when we think about the benefits to the whole child and the whole family, right? Not just safety, but health, well-being. I mean, Sophie has a paper on food insecurity and child tax credit, right? When you think of all the benefits that are conveyed to families, it does kind of send this message that it's like, well, maybe we should just focus on children and families and then the benefits that accrue over the long run of investing in children in terms of preventing maltreatment, but also making sure that their basic needs are met, that they're not food insecure, for example.
That study, by the way, I thought that was really very interesting what you did with Brookings there, looking at which states tended to be most helped. I guess if I had to, like, if somebody was like, guess where these boxes would come out, I don't think I would have seen it in I'll link the people to that study as well in our show notes for this episode. But if you want to just kind of briefly explain that as well, go ahead.
Of course. So there's a lot of interest, obviously, in the federal expansion of the CTC, but also how it affected people and families based on where they lived and the pre-existing or like the baseline poverty rates. And this study was in part inspired by the fact that we wanted to understand how this affected states. And some preliminary evidence looking at like simulating the effect of the CTC expansion across states. So not looking at the actual expansion, but kind of simulating earlier data consistently showed that you saw larger reductions in states that were lower cost and smaller reductions in high cost states. So for example, the reduction of the federal expansion would be smaller in California, New York, Hawaii, all these higher cost states, and larger in Louisiana and Tennessee, for example. And that actually has to do with, in part, the fact that it just takes more to move above the poverty line under the SPM by state. So higher cost states have a higher poverty line, and lower cost states don't. The flip side of this is that those higher cost states also more frequently have some sort of complement to federal policy. So they might have a federal complement to the EITC or some sort of other kind of complements to federal policy, so that there are mechanisms for extending the effects of those federal credits in those states that the states can kind of tie on to. So you see a lot of, across the country right now, a lot of states advancing their own state level child tax credits that would complement, the federal credit, particularly if the federal credit was re-expanded, right? And so they could work together to truly reach low income families. And you see a lot, like California has their young child tax credit. And there's just a lot of momentum across the states right now. But at the same time, states that have a lower poverty line tend to not have this supplement to the federal policy. And so it actually just reinforces the importance of the federal expansion in states where there's fewer complements and fewer state level policies that are benefiting low income families.
If I recall correctly, both of these studies kind of pull out a pretty oversized effect for single parents. Is that correct? In the simulation and both what you found with CTC?
Yeah. So under current law, 70% of children who have a single parent are ineligible for the full CTC. So when you fill in that gap, making the CTC fully refundable, you see a large reduction in poverty rates among families with single parents. So that's just like a clear kind of one-to-one relationship.
So we have your simulation. We have a healthy amount of relatively recent studies that do some connecting up of changes in the safety net to lower reports of maltreatment. I think you guys went down a level to the investigations, but I'm sure there's even more going on right now studying the tax credit and other aspects of pandemic relief. What, in your guys' view, are the kind of remaining unanswered questions or research topics in this space? Like, what, if anything, do we need to still find answers about when it comes to this nexus between anti-poverty measures and child protection action?
Look, that's a good question. So there's still a lot of folks who are working on, and our groups as well, like thinking about the impacts of the expanded child tax credit on a range of things that affect maltreatment. And the problem with most of these studies studying expanded child tax credit is it was a one-time thing. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of folks are asking, well, what would happen in the long run, right? Just from the economy, and also how people respond to receiving money over a longer period of time. What would this look like? How would it be different? Would other safety net programs be changed in certain states, or would there be other responses that we're unaware of? So like my colleague here, Lonnie Berger, and I have a study that's looking at parental employment, for example. And there's other folks who are thinking about like other outcomes that affect child's well-being. So all of these things, certainly there's so many questions, there's so many pieces of the puzzle that are still being answered, in addition to more studies about child maltreatment. But there still remains this question, right? Like until we can actually observe families who are averted, their involvement with CPS is averted. Like if we can look at these families longitudinally, we might be able to know more about who they are and how exactly that encounter was averted, right? Was it through these mechanisms that we're hypothesizing? Is it through, like I said, a reduction in stress or increase in parental investments or somehow a change in parenting behavior? Or is it just because they're not interacting with social services personnel and they're not subjected to those reports from those people? We don't really know. So once we can see these families or see the families that we think were averted, then we might have a better sense as to how this policy could impact families in the long run, and also how to better design systems, right? So that families don't necessarily have to encounter CPS in order to get the types of services they need. And then also the families that actually do need intervention by CPS can receive those services much quicker because there'll be fewer reports to screen out.
Yeah. Sophie, anything to add to that?
Well, Jessica's as the real expert in the CPS and Child Protective Service involvement space, but I have a kind of a question for her and for both of you, I guess, is like what your thoughts are about how these effects interact with regional variations in just cost of living, and how when we're thinking about federal policy or even state level policy, how we think in these kind of single dollar terms, which actually mean very different. They mean different things in different places. And if there's been any work kind of exploring that intersection of income and affordability with child protective service involvement as an outcome.
I mean, there's folks who have very detailed qualitative data about families, and then also detailed like spending and local, cost of living data. But I think the place to start is to think about like policy context, right? So what other policies exist in a place that make a policy more or less affordable, for example, or effective? And I think this is what people are starting to think about. And this is what the experiment of the expanded child tax credit enables us to do. It enables to say everyone in the US had this one, investment, this expanded child tax credit at the same time, but we know that it had different effects in different places, like you were saying, Sophie, because policy context, cost of living, access to work, all of these other things. So I think that's what folks are thinking about, but it's still a very unexplored space, in my opinion, as far as child maltreatment, child safety, and well-being.
Yeah. Isn't this going to be stupid on the way I describe it? But I feel like you guys could make this work. But I feel like, Sophie, like it's almost like your findings on the CTC impact in those different buckets of states, it would almost be kind of like on some level, it's like sort of run your guys' simulation effects through that, knowing that actually happened to some extent in real life. Like, because I do think that's really important to know that, it was there were certain states that were like much, much bigger winners in terms of like how that stuff affected child poverty. I'll throw another one at you that would be really interesting in this nexus would be I don't know if there's a way to get at this, but one of the largest reasons for removals into foster care, when they list them out, and often there's more than one, is parental drug use, and how these things, anti-poverty perhaps in varying regions, impacts substance abuse and indicated substance abuse in child protection cases would be like super interesting. But man, that does sound like a tough lift to try and work that third thing into the mix,
Yeah, there's a lot of folks in this space studying parental substance abuse and child abuse and neglect and involvement with CPS and foster care. I haven't heard of any studies that are looking at that specifically, but you can imagine so many ways, especially since, family first implementation is starting to happen, right? You can imagine many, many ways in which the expanded child tax credit would affect involvement with CPS. But it is an interesting question because it's a problem that's persisting and it's not going away. And it's not just limited to opioids, right? It's really widespread and especially terrible in more rural places. So one of the things that we lack in terms of child welfare data is detail on those very small counties. With the administrative data that we use, those small counties are de-identified. So we basically can't see what happens in the small counties, which I think will affect the ability to answer that question in a meaningful and causal way, unless folks can really see what happens in those small counties, because we know that that's where a lot of the opioid epidemic is especially rampant and consequential.
I was just talking to a statistician last month about how infuriating that has become, and as like research and the questions are getting better, that's becoming more and more of a problem. He was saying he's hoping to like negotiate some sort of grand bargain with the feds on just making it a little easier for you guys. Because there's like some pretty big places that disappear. Actually, it's not just little rural places.
We hired for a different project looking at other safety net programs in child abuse and neglect. We hired a data scientist to help scrape the publicly available data on small counties, and it turns out that this paper is not written up, but it turns out that it does matter, that if you use the average for those counties, there's a lot of variation within the small counties. And the average works sometimes, but not always. So we know that it matters. And there's a lot of people doing work with this more granular small county data that's sometimes limited to specific states that has shown that these small counties are meaningful. So I think with respect to your question, having that data would be really wonderful.
Yeah. And sneak preview, keep checking the University of Wisconsin website for that research to drop. All right, Jessica Pack and Sophie Collyer, thank you guys so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks to Jessica Pack of the University of Wisconsin's Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work and Sophie Collyer of the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes The Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anchoco, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.